unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Geoffrey Moore, who is, in addition to being a prolific author, also works as a consultant and advisor to lots of different companies, goes around giving all sorts of super interesting talks. Just to mention a few of the books that you've written, the most famous, of course, is Crossing the Chasm, which I think it's now, I don't know, sold millions of copies.
I think it's probably approaching 2 million now. It's in 12 different languages, and it's a playbook that's held up over the years.
I know, and it was published first in 1989, I believe.
Yeah, maybe 1990, but yeah, that was the time frame.
Yeah, and now, of course, you're on the third edition, which is great because it updates a lot of the stories, mentions companies that we may have heard of, and not the ones that, unless you were living through the 80s like me or the 90s,
Exactly.
you might have forgotten some of these. But of course, you followed up with a bunch of other successors, which provided equally vivid imagery, right? Like Inside the Tornado, Escape Velocity. One of my favorites, Dealing with Darwin, Living on the Fault Line, The Guerrilla Game. I've got this one, of course. This is Zone to Win, super classic already. And the most recent book, I think it's the most recent book from 2020, is The Infinite Staircase, What the Universe Tells Us About Life, Ethics, and Mortality. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for having me, Greg.
Well, look, I've read these books over the years and incorporate a lot of the concepts into my teaching. And I encounter people all across Silicon Valley and elsewhere who, if they haven't already internalized everything, they at least are familiar with the terminology and the concepts, which have been introduced to mainstream nomenclature. But I think what most people don't know about you, and I didn't know about you until I got The Infinite Staircase, is that you started off as a Renaissance English scholar, an expert, right, on Spenser, of all people, and the Fairy Queen, which is probably the least read classic of the English language. And you were a professor for a while. And then at some point you decided to just toss that away. And it reminds me, because one of the books that you wrote was about how you need to avoid being imprisoned by the past. And it immediately made me think about your career path, which you somehow shed this like a lobster sheds its shell and moved into a different territory. But you've kind of gone back a bit with The Infinite Staircase to being a humanist. I don't think you ever stopped being a humanist because so much of your work is about the people and the mindset and, working in organizations. But this book does, it does a lot. And I think the title of your dissertation was something like A Strategy for Living. Is that right?
Yeah.
And that's what this book is.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about, first of all, why did you make that break? Why did you leave academia? And if you did leave academia, you could have gone into something like, I don't know, publishing or editing or something a little bit more closely. Was this a real break, or did you see this as a continuation of your...
This was like this is a random event from the universe. So Marie and I had 3 children. We're interracial marriages in the 70s. Marie's Filipino. I'm teaching in Michigan, rural Michigan. Love the teaching, love the thing. But the culture of rural Michigan in the 70s was not particularly conducive to, a Hapa family. And we would always come back to the West Coast every summer. The minute I handed in my grade book, we were driving out of town, and we didn't come back to town until the day before school started. And after 4 years of this, Marie said, I need to take the children back to California. Do you want to come? and it was like, yes, I do. But there was no job. I had no sense. What I did, I graduated from Stanford. So I thought, okay, well, Stanford, there's got to be something. And at that time, I'd heard about a place called Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley. I thought, well, maybe there's something I could do in Silicon Valley. So anyway, I got back and I ended up, looking for a job and got a job as a training director in a software firm. And I said, I don't know anything about software, but I do know something about training. And so let's see what we can do. And the guy who hired me obviously thought, here's a hypo kid I'm going to be able to shape. I was a completely blank slate. And he was that kind of guy. He was a terrific mentor. So anyway, that's how I got into tech. And after a while I was there and I became kind of the assistant to the president because I was sort of bright and articulate and did stuff. But then I thought, I can't be a staff guy for the rest of my life. That's not going to work. So I thought I've either got to make it or sell it. Well, I wasn't going to make it. So I thought, okay, well, I'll sell it. And it turned out I was really good at opening and not so good at closing. So that turns out to be marketing more than selling. And I really didn't get my traction until I joined a company called Regis McKenna, which was the premier marketing consultancy in high tech at the time. And
by the way, I recently did a podcast with a historian of Silicon Valley, and Regis plays a huge role in that history.
He should. And he was the guy that kind of, I would argue, invented high-tech marketing. Prior to that, Procter & Gamble was marketing, and it was all promotional. It had nothing to do with high-tech marketing. So, and I'd been a client. One of the software firms I'd been at was a client of Regis, and I'd worked with the team, and I really enjoyed that work. So anyway, I had a chance to work at the firm. And I'm there, and it's like the third week there, I'm going, I can do this better than anybody else here. This is exactly what I'm supposed to do. It was all about framework. The thing that ties the whole work together is I'm really interested in how when you don't have enough data about a situation, you can't use research-based or data-based decision-making because there's not enough data. So you have to use narrative. You tell a story about the future, and then you try to figure out, is that a credible story? So it's really, it's a form of literary criticism. And so basically, venture is a form of literary criticism prior to investment. And then as you invest, you start to figure out, now, how can I verify? How can I validate? And eventually the analytics and the numbers become very important, but not at the beginning. At the beginning, it's really about the story. And of course, Regis was all about storytelling. It was high-tech PR. It was, what's the story? And so I love that. And so that kind of led me to write the first book. And the first book was about, well, at Regis, we're having all these incredible launches. I mean, they were so good at that. And then the companies would kind of like go off the radar. And you kind of, well, what happened? And enough of it was happening, I thought there's something structural here. And so that's when, spent some time with the technology adoption life cycle, thought, okay, there's a break in the life cycle. And that was what the chasm was. It was this break between the visionary early market customers and the pragmatic mainstream customers. And they really don't have a lot in common. And they're not, it's very hard to cross the chasm. And so that was what the book was about. And that book, it started off, when I went to the publisher with it, they thought, well, it's a niche book, I don't know. And so they said, well, my agent wanted a $50,000 advance. And they said, no, how about $10,000? And I said, fine. But I said, but how many books would you have to sell in order to break even? And they said, I think 5,000. And I said, well, what would it be to be like a smash hit? Anything over 10,000. So I said, so could we raise the royalty after 10,000? So like from 12% to 15%? Sure, no problem. And what happened was the first month it did sell 6 months it did sell 3,000. The next it was 6, the next it was 12. It was a word of mouth thing. And so the word of mouth thing, and it was a book that engineers liked because engineers like systems and they like frameworks and they knew about marketing, but they didn't really like marketing. But they thought it was pretty interesting. And so that's kind of how it caught on.
Well, did you find that the sales of the book followed the same trajectory? Were there some early adopters who bought the book?
What really happened was HP Education Group, for whatever reason, was an early adopter of this workshop that I was doing. And so I probably did 35 workshops with them over the next several years in every continent on the planet, which was hugely, it was a wonderful experience for me. Working with the company was terrific. But that also spread virally, and so people were saying, oh yeah, this chasm thing. And the chasm problem, if you were a product manager in high tech, you had a really disruptive product, you were going to hit the chasm, and nobody was giving you any. Every time it happened, people said, well, really bad marketing, really, not a good enough product. Nobody was actually suggesting that it was structural. And so I think I was sort of a little bit like psychotherapy. I mean, it's like, it's not me. And so I think that really helped. And then the playbook, the fact that there was a playbook, I think really, really helped.
Well, what is the relationship between sales and marketing? In academia, we don't even teach sales. And I think a lot of my marketing colleagues would say, if you do the marketing right, you don't need to do sales. And, now, of course, with product-led growth, we've got folks who are also saying like, who needs sales?
I think the correct term for that is bullshit. Because, by the way, in consumer marketing, you don't need sales. Consumers actually buy things. But companies review purchase decisions before they make them. And somebody has to manage that process of getting it through the purchasing process, particularly if you're going to do things at scale. And so the key, and by the way, it's absolutely a travesty that business schools don't teach sales. It's crazy. And there are a bunch of people that have made that argument before. But basically, the reason why academics didn't like sales is it felt too much like Glenn Carey, Glenn Ross, sleazy, closers, coffee is for closers, and all the kind of stuff that academics hate. But the point about it is, particularly in contemporary sales, B2B sales, that's not what a salesperson does anymore. You have to help the customer find the use cases and the ROI that validates why they're going to buy this thing, which means you have to be intellectually curious about their business and not just yammer about your own business. And so it's really actually a really interesting profession if you approach it, in a kind of more in service to the customer approach, as opposed to I'm going to make my commissions and go to club. Although that's also a big motive among salespeople.
Yeah, I mean, I tell my students that they need to understand the customer's business better than the customer, right? Because if the customer understood it better than them, then they wouldn't need to sell in a way, right?
It's key. I think you have outsider's advantage. So in one sense, the customer knows their business much better than you do, and will always know it better than you do. But what they can't do is see it from the outside in. And so what I think what we can do as both as teachers, as consultants, as salespeople, is help them look at it from the outside in, meaning why does the world want your company to be successful? As opposed to, how do I make the world do what I want it to do?
Well, could you talk a bit more about the role of narrative? Because it seems like, narrative and storytelling can unlock imagination, right? Where you can see how the world might be different than the way it is now.
Yeah, I mean, to me, narrative is humanity's superpower. If you think about what can people do that gorillas can't do, and a lot of it has to do with using language to figure out cause and effect. Well, cause and effect is a story. Hume makes this very famous thing about correlation is not causation, and so where's the causation really coming from? It's a story. You tell it. It's a plot. You have actors who do stuff, and then you have to critique that narrative, because some of the narrative is baloney. We're getting a lot of baloney from our political leaders right now. I mean, a lot of baloney. And it's really important that we know how to critique baloney and protect ourselves against it. Well, the same thing's true in business. The same thing's true in investing. And so I think, the interest in narrative, first of all, I'm attracted to narrative. I have an Irish background. We've told stories. My whole family told stories all my life. So I love stories. But I knew that some of the stories were truer than others. Yeah. Although sometimes the ones that weren't true in fact were true in spirit. That was another category. But anyway, but in terms of business and engineering and market development, you have to have a story, and because it's about what could happen. Like AI right now, we're trying to figure out what the right stories are to tell about AI, and we know that AI is going to do something, but I think how do you navigate that? And right now, it's still a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, and it seems like if you're going to be a good storyteller and use narrative effectively, you need to have empathy. And empathy wasn't one of the steps on your staircase, but I think it sits down below narrative, right? Somewhere in the consciousness or the values part.
I think, the staircase, well, we should talk a little bit about what the staircase is.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Because, I mean, this book is, I was amazed at how you were able to put this together in a way that I don't think I've ever seen it done before by people who've been spending their whole lives doing this stuff.
Well, so the idea behind the Infinite Staircase was I was raised in a religious tradition, but not with a religious family. But I certainly absorbed all of Christian ethics and of course my literature was a medieval and Renaissance literature, which is completely imbued and infused with Christian ethics and Christian worldviews. But, I also became fascinated with the secular account of creation, like the Big Bang and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, really, and then when I got involved with molecular biology of the cell, it was like just blew up my whole brain. So I love the secular story about creation. Well, then I have this thing, well, how would you, if there's no God, why would you be good? I mean, well, where does ethics come from in a secular narrative? And so I said, well, let me recap the secular narrative. Well, that turned out to be 2/3 of the book. It turns out, because every step in that staircase has a whole body of knowledge behind it that's very, very arcane and very, very deep. And I got as deep as I could. But the point is, you could sort of see how reality was building up from physics to chemistry to biology. and then you got to conscious living things, and what desire and consciousness and values and culture, and then humans came along with language, and it was language, narrative, analytics, and theory. So there was like 11 steps in this framework, but the idea behind it was. The key idea that really was the powerful idea behind it was the idea that the Santa Fe Institute sort of exposed me to was emergence. The idea that systems will self-organize in emergent ways without an outside intelligent designer. And that's the alternative to the creation myth. Well, that's a fascinating myth. So anyway, the first 2/3 of the book was, how would that work? How would you get from the Big Bang to Greg and Jeff talking to each other, on a Riverside podcast, without divine intervention? How could that even possibly happen? And that's kind of a story. And then the last third was, okay, well, if that's the story you want to work with, now where do values come from? Now, why do we care? Why does it matter what we do, et cetera, et cetera? And so that was the last third of the book.
Well, I love how the book is rooted in this whole concept of entropy, right? And the law of thermodynamics. And it seems like almost everything that's interesting is essentially something which slows down, right? Or diverts the entropy in a different direction, right? That's where complexity comes from.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea was, if you had to have a brute force, then you got to be careful with any emergent model. You don't want to be reductive with it. You don't want, like, I hate it when physicists say, well, all chemistry is physics. And the answer is, well, why didn't you invent plastic? I mean, because it's not. Okay. But the point is it anchored in physics? Yes. Is biology anchored in chemistry? Yes. So at each level, there's a thing. And so, but the first level, the physics level, was the idea of the Big Bang is, hey, there was a Big Bang because it was too hot. It just needed to cool down. And so you could trace the energy in the world. I mean, you can use it as a framework to say all the energy that's ever existed at the Big Bang. That's the theory of the Big Bang. And basically all the universe has been doing ever since for 13.8 billion years is trying to cool down. And then where does all the order and marvelous stuff come from? It comes from diverting that energy into creating complexity. And that's where, and each stair finds a way to create the next layer of complexity going forward. So there's a mechanism of entropy at the very bottom, kind of like electricity in a computer. I mean, you could say, well, it's all just electrons. What we're doing here is it's just photons and electrons. But it's like, well, yeah, but I don't think people would be tuning into the broadcast for just electrons and photons. There's other stuff.
Well, I feel like you could have also created a different branch off of this thing to talk about organizations, right? Because organizations are also about kind of keeping entropy at bay. I actually use this metaphor on day one of my strategy class. I say, entropy's coming for you in the form of perfect competition. So, you gotta keep it at bay somehow for at least a little while so you can make some money.
When you think about it, one of the ironies of creativity and success in business is whenever you overcome entropy, the only way to do that is by creating more entropy. In other words, you cannot create order without creating more entropy than you create order. That's the second law of thermodynamics. So there's an irony built into that. But having said all that, the increasing emergence of new layers of capability, that's what it's about. And by the way, where we're at right now with organizations is, we had an organizational model. You and I grew up in a world where the organizational model was essentially hierarchical, and basically it was sort of modeled after the military after a while. It
was Alfred Chandler, right?
Yeah,
just
yeah. And you
could
scale everything in a kind of a very clear way. And then all of a sudden there was just too much. That system could not respond to the amount of change that we were encountering, and so that we've completely restructured our things to be more collaborative, more interoperative. Looks more like Kubernetes and less like System 370 IBM mainframes. But we started with mainframes, and we had a mainframe organization, and now we have kind of an object-oriented, engineered world.
Well, I mean, it's clear Darwin plays a big role in this story, right? I mean, he shows up pretty much at the bottom of almost at the bottom of the staircase, right?
He shows up. He shows up as soon as. So after chemistry, so you have physics, chemistry, and biology, and then built into biology is desire. And that was kind of the connection. And then the desire is and a desire is just a chemical phenomenon at this point. There's no desiring. There's just bacteria. Bacteria.
It's a gradient seeking, right?
Yeah,
Something like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
We're just seeking to essentially find our best form of equilibrium, but it's dynamic equilibrium. And it keeps repeating itself. I mean, if you think about it, we worry about, are we taking care of the planet correctly as life? So probably as stewards, we're not doing the job we're supposed to be doing, but the planet doesn't care. The life's been on this planet for over 4 billion years, and it's not stopping anytime soon. And it's completely taken over the entire planet. So how did it do that? And what Darwin let us figure out is there's a competition, wherever there's a competition for scarce resources, you're going to reward increasing complexity that leverages those resources in some more intelligent way, which is kind of, by the way, what we're doing with AI right now. I mean, we're trying to leverage compute resources in a more intelligent, more exciting way. And I think that's, that theme runs through the whole staircase.
Now, to what extent was this staircase idea inspired by the great chain of being, right, which permeates all the work in the Renaissance and the Middle Ages?
It's so great. Yeah, I mean, basically, it's Edmund Spencer, the guy that I wrote the dissertation on, but Shakespeare and everybody believed in the great chain of being, but they were designing it from. And by the way, all religions believe in a kind of great chain of being, but they always start at the top. So they start with perfection, which would be God, and then you kind of work down through hierarchies of things, and you get to angels and the medieval thing, and then you get to people, and then you get to animals, and then you get to vegetables, and then you get to rocks. And Aristotle did a version of the same thing with the Greek stuff. And whatever. And the only difference between that, so the hierarchical, the idea that reality is made up of levels of organization is a profound idea, which I totally embrace. The only the book said, though, but you want to build the staircase from the bottom up, not from the top down. And the reason you want to build it from the bottom up, well, the reason you don't want to build it from the top down is it just creates all kinds of conflict. And I mean, if you look at the amount of conflict in the world going on right now in our own, it's all built, it comes from the top down. And you just would rather build it from the bottom up. So that's so all of our values, instead of coming from God, I claim came from being mammals. So for me, when the transition in Darwinism, where you go from just reptiles and to mammals nurture their young, and mammals respect their tribal leaders. If you think about the values that I grew up with and that I still try to live by today, that's love and empathy and taking care of people that need it, and having respect and honoring order, and that's kind of the deal. That's built into a wolf pack and into a tribe of gorillas and into a bunch of squirrels hanging out in my backyard. I mean, that's how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think the people who believed in the great chain of being back in the day, I mean, they would say, get as close to God as possible, right? So get to the top staircase, right? That's your goal in life. And I think you're saying that, look, there's more to life than the top third of the staircase.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, it's not like don't go to God. And that's not the point. I think the point is, maybe the point is, at any given moment, one stair might be taking priority in that moment. It might be a stair about values. It might be culture. We talk about culture, and culture is what you and I are doing right here. So culture is how do we pass Darwinistic survival techniques, not genetically, but through interaction with each other. So maybe right now you and I are going to spend time dealing with ideas. It's predominantly culture, and we're using a lot of language, of course, to do that. But I think so there's a time to tell stories, but then there's a time to question stories. And so the analytics layer, is a check on the narrative layer. But the narrative layer, to me, if I had to pick one, well, obviously I'm an English major. If I had to pick one of the 11 stairs that I sort of live on and organize my life around, it's probably narratives.
Well, I mean, I think in business schools, I think we tend to emphasize the top as well. I mean, we emphasize analytics, we emphasize theory even more. And those are pretty much the domain that we live in. And when you start to go down a little further, we say, hey, hold on a second, right? Like you're jumping into system one. We don't want you going there. I mean, does that create, I don't know, a stunted type of manager?
Yes, it does. I mean, look, the danger of the academic model is that if it shies away from getting its hands dirty, or it's getting its feet stuck in the mud, then it's going to always have some version of a Platonic castles in air quality to it. You mentioned, for example, that business schools don't, tend to shun sales. That's part of that instinct to say, no, I want to stay in the world of theory. I want to stay in the world of it's cleaner. It's more. I want to give the same lecture this year that I gave last year. Like, why? I mean, honest to God, really? And by the way, I mean, you and I know professors that have given the same lecture for 25 years. and it's like, no, I mean, come on, engage with the world. And so I think that's the danger. And the problem is, I remember as a professor realizing, because between being a TA and being a prof, I was 10 years teaching in the academic world. And by the way, I loved it. I mean, and arguably I've never stopped since. But the thing you realize is I'm teaching the same age cohort every year. And, after a few years, if you can't be smarter than the next group of 18-year-olds, shame on you. But you're not growing. Will they bring new ideas to you? Yes. If you're empathetic, can you listen? Yes, you can develop yourself if you get aggressive with it. But it's really easy to start thinking you're the smartest person in the room. It's really easy to start thinking that the students work for you, which isn't true. You work for the students. And so, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on that I found when I actually left academics, I thought I was sort of like joining the Philistines, like leaving the true faith and joining the true. But, I got into a business and I looked around and I thought, these people are taking real risks. I mean, the problem with students is that they don't really, unless they're very impassioned students, they're not taking risks. And if you don't take risks, you're not really learning. You're not really getting into it. So I think that I think academics, God knows I still want the university system. I think it's one of the great assets of our country. I think, by the way, what we're doing to our university system with our political bullshit is really dangerous. And I'm hoping that people will find a way to push back against that. Because the narratives, right now, social media and politics have created a narrative. It might not be too hard to call it a crisis. I think we're experiencing a crisis of narrative, and I would be shocked if that narrative, if that doesn't create significant social change.
Well, it's funny because I've taught undergrads, I've taught, full-time MBAs, part-time MBAs, executive MBAs, and, executives. I haven't yet started teaching in the nursing home. That's going to, be on my,
just move the tube to the other side of the mouth. I can listen carefully.
Yeah, right. I'm getting there. Right. But what I found is that, when you're teaching the youngest people, you can actually focus on the analytics and the theory. But as you start going further up through the hierarchy, you have to actually start going further down the staircase, right? And I've had some folks who have friends of mine who've become CEOs, and they found that it was very uncomfortable initially because they found that most of their job is, telling stories and doing alignment and, all the stuff that is, we might think of it as squishier in a way.
Yeah, but if you think about an organism and you say, what does the pack want from the leader? What does the organization want from the CEO or the senior vice president? Or if you're running a team of 4 people, what does your team still want from you as a team manager? And I think it is a narrative. You have to have a narrative. I mean, yes, you can have rules, and yes, you can have, we have these KPIs, and we have objectives, and we have OKRs, and we're going to have a performance review, we're going to have a salary review, and there's a bunch of mechanical things that are essentially analytic in nature that are important to discipline and measure and keep cadence. But if there's not a story behind the whole thing, why am I coming to work? I mean, what's the point? And my dad's generation was to make money, to get a job, to not be hungry. I mean, it was God bless, and that's, by the way, that's a pretty good narrative. But most of the children, well, my generation, and certainly the generations I taught, they were more entitled than that. They were not really worried about them. They did not go through the Depression, and so now, by the way, the current crop of people trying to graduate this year are having a bit of a challenge because of all the stuff that's going on. It's hard to get a job right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we can't have a podcast about business without talking about AI, but it does seem like, there are 2 narratives here. One is that with the spread of AI, you need to lean even more deeply into STEM and need to understand how algorithms work and data sets and so forth. But there's another narrative, which is, hey, that you need to lean into the humanist side of things.
Yeah, I
right?
think actually
And
the first narrative, if you want that stuff, great. But the truth is, that's not the survival. The survival mechanism is the second one, because if you can't do the second one, then you if
who's
you
going to do
can't
it?
leverage well, if you can't leverage AI, if you can't use AI as a power tool in your work, you're going to be way behind the curve. I mean, because it clearly is a power tool. And could it be a power tool for bad stuff? Yes, it could. Should you abdicate decision making to AI? No, not you should not. But that begs the question. So then, what's the narrative, and what are the analytics for AI? And that I think it's still emerging. But you have to have a narrative. You can't not have a narrative. It doesn't work.
Well, look, when I think back to your original work, I think of it as being applicable primarily to startups. That are introducing a brand new product and trying to figure out how do you get into the mind of the customer and so forth. But I think about the later work like Zone to Win. These are mature companies and they're trying to launch new products. They're trying to undergo some kind of transformation. And I remember I used to think that entrepreneurial strategy and corporate strategy were separate domains, separate disciplines. I don't think that anymore.
No, you can't.
I mean, it seems like if you're not entrepreneurial, I don't care how successful you are.
Well,
You can be
it's like-
Microsoft, you
yeah.
can be Salesforce. You have an advantage, but you need to have that mindset, right?
But I mean, I think you and I are in the post Clay Christensen era, right? Because Clay was the guy who put that on the table with the innovator's dilemma. He just said, look, the management system that we teach at the Harvard Business School will cause your company to become marginalized and irrelevant if that's all you do. And by the way, you will be following our rules step by step, exactly the way we taught them, and you will marginalize your enterprise. So because we did separate entrepreneurial strategy from corporate strategy, and at first blush, that made total sense because corporate strategy does not help a startup. Startup, we don't need no stinking strategy. I mean, the startups, it's got its own rhythm, and so crossing the chasm was how you said, how would a startup do it? Zone to Win was okay, same journey, same problem set that the startup's trying to solve, but you do not have venture capital, and B, you don't have permission to lose money the way a startup has permission to lose. I mean, venture is designed to lose money. In fact, venture doesn't actually care if you ever make money as long as you become powerful. Because by the time the venture company exits, you may or may not. I mean, Uber was not making money when it went public, right? It's how much power do you have? So now you're an established enterprise. Well, most of your existing power comes from your inertial momentum behind the business you've had for decades or whatever. And you want to nurture that power and you want to sustain it and keep it growing for it. But the playbook that runs that inertial momentum is completely contradicted by the playbook that runs the disruptive innovation. And so then how in the world would you reconcile it? And that's what the zones were for. They were just to say, look, these are different operating models. You need to zone your business and have, just like you have industrial zones and commercial zones and residential zones, same thing in a business. You can't put a factory next to the elementary school, next to the swimming pool.
But look, I mean, BCG had their matrix back in the 70s, right? So why didn't people adequately understand this idea of kind of managing your portfolio?
By the way, the BCG matrix is very close to the zone to win model. So they have the rising stars and the lazy dogs and that kind of stuff. I don't think it honored the internal contradictions. Particularly the operating model contradictions. So each of those four quadrants in the BCG model got the quadrant right, but it didn't get the dynamics of running the four quadrants all together at the same time right. And so what would happen is what we call the performance zone would always get the lion's share of the resources, and then the productivity zone, as the company got older and older, actually the productivity zone got more power than the performance. And one of the ways you know a company is sort of going into its marginal state is when the CFO has more power than the CEO.
Yeah.
And it happens a lot. It happens a lot. Yeah.
Well, look, I'm at a university, which is the legacy. I mean, look, the book Zone to Win, you were talking about companies like Salesforce and Microsoft. I mean, you weren't talking about the, House of England and the, UC Berkeley. I mean, these legacy companies, these legacy enterprises, I mean, they should have an advantage, right? I mean,
Yes.
if your
brand is terrific.
right, you got the brand, you've got all these channels, you've got all sorts of stuff. Why is it that these enterprises fail? I mean, look, you wrote a whole book on it. So,
I think at some point, in order to scale, and then in order to keep things going, you put more and more attention into your internal metrics and your internal operations. In business, it would be finance. In academics, it might be something, a combination of publishing, prize-winning academics, the kind of academic stuff. But the problem is you become increasingly focused on yourself, and that's the beginning of the end. So the end of the beginning is, but the thing you got to do to refresh is you have to put yourself in service to something outside of yourself. And if you think about education, look, we're supposed to be in service to the students. And if you look at what we actually are doing, a lot of what we do is not. It's in service to ourselves. It's not in service to the students. And some amount of that is necessary because we all need to be served at some level. But when you start having your reason for being to be in service to somebody other than the student, like, for example, right now, there's a whole lot of people in this country that want the school to indoctrinate the child in a value system that they feel is under threat or is under assault. That's not the job of the school. The job of the school is to be in service to the child. Now, they would argue, well, yeah, but that is in service to the child. And that's not a crazy idea. But the point is, we don't want to, when I was in academics, it was clear that once you had tenure, you thought, well, I'm more in service to me. I don't want to teach as much. And by the way, I want TAs. And I don't want to grade themes. And it was all that kind of stuff. Now, God bless AI. The good news is if I were teaching composition again, I would have ChatGPT grade the themes. But we would do other things. But I think there's some ways in which we can serve ourselves and still serve the students. And the same thing with business. Businesses end up serving their investors before they serve their customers, and the employees come third. And the correct sequence has to be customers first, employees second, investors third. Any other sequence doesn't work, not for sustainable success.
Well, look, there's another problem, and you talk about bandwidth, right? I mean, you talk about focus, and I've always been puzzled by this, right? Like, why is it that there is finite bandwidth? Like, why can't organizations do multiple things at the same time? I mean, there are companies that do it. I mean, you look at Amazon. It's doing a million things, and they're doing them all pretty well. And you look at Google, and Google is doing a bunch of things. I mean, why is it that we have this finite bandwidth or focus or attention so much so that we can't do multiple things, explore and exploit at the same time?
Yeah, I think what happens is we've professionalized disciplines. So we have finance, we have HR, we have manufacturing, we have IT, we have sales, we have engineering. And at some point, when you professionalize the disciplines, they silo. And by the way, silos is how you get stuff done. I mean, leave me alone. I'm going to do my stuff. But now we've given up flexibility. We've given up that stuff. And so the way you have to get around that is a narrative which reframes everybody's attitude to say it's not about us. As long as it's about us, we're going to end up in this trap. But if we say no, and by the way, the two narratives in the zone to win, Salesforce and Microsoft. Microsoft's way of making it not about us was to make it about the competition. These guys are going to eat our lunch. I learned the phrase existential threat from Microsoft. And basically, they were incredibly good about using the competition as a way of galvanizing the entire company.
And what they did was absolutely remarkable. I mean,
astounding. It's the most successful track record probably in the history of tech ever.
Yeah.
The Tiger Woods of tech. Okay. Salesforce is more interested in more around we're letting the customer down, which is another way of getting outside of yourself. We could continue doing what we're doing right now. We don't have to add AI to CRM. CRM's working fine. Well, but we'd be letting the customer down. And so they're going to make sacrifices to go in their direction. Clearly, Satya and team made some serious sacrifices to get Azure, up and running. Now that it has, it's of course become. It's so interesting. There's no longer a Windows division at Microsoft. And my whole life, Windows was like the flywheel that made Microsoft successful. No, there's no.
It's crazy.
There's a product, but there's no division.
Well, so how do you get the performance folks on board? I mean, because they have their own KPIs and metrics. I mean, I guess one way is just to abolish their division. I mean,
No,
how do you?
no, I don't think that's. I think in the short term, you want. I mean, silos work, and focus works, and compensation-driven sales works, and KPI stuff and OKRs, they work. It's just you can't make them a religion. It's a tool, and you can and so McKinsey's have this model about the 3 horizons. Horizon 1 is the next fiscal year, Horizon 2 is the next couple of years, Horizon 3 is the further out. There's a tool set for each horizon, and there's a zone for each horizon in the zone model. And so the idea behind that is if you're in the Horizon 1 zone, you should act, you should be competitive, you should make your number, you should make the plan, you should, not spend time idly daydreaming about what the future could be. But if you're in the incubation zone, you should. And by the way, you should not be spending time trying to make the number, and you should not waste time coming up with some crazy forecast that you're saying is conservative because you just made it up anyway. I mean, in venture, it was so funny. The least credible slide in any venture presentation is the financial slide. It's just, and the entrepreneur always introduces it by saying, well, we wanted to be really conservative here. So we just said, like 2% of a mythological story. It was like, come on, guys.
Do they still have them?
Well, they still have which?
Do they still have these financial slides? I mean, I thought
yeah. No, usually there's somebody that says, because and look, it's not a bad analytic to start with. Is what would the TAM be, or what would the SAM be? Okay, all right, it's fine. But the idea, and then the problem in large companies is because often in the annual budgeting process, those numbers are used to justify how much budget you get. What you find is the incubation zone's trying to use the performance zone storylines and metrics in order to get more funding. That's a failure mode. Venture capitalists do not fund performance, they fund power. But everything in a venture model is about becoming more powerful, not becoming more performant. When they exit, then they'll become performant, but not now. And that idea is still very hard to land in a large corporation.
So if you want to move something from the incubation zone to the transformation zone, what criteria do you use? I mean, is it similar to the criteria that a venture capitalist would use for, getting the next funding round? I mean, is it?
It's interesting.
Is there a difference?
Yeah, I think if you were a disruptor, like Amazon's been a disruptor or Netflix been a disruptor, with Amazon with AWS, Netflix with streaming, then yes, you would actually use the venture thing of saying, is it now time to put? It's like a Series C investor, in venture. Is it time to put a lot of wood behind the arrow? Most corporations are not disruptors, nor should they be. What they are is they're at risk at being disruptees. And so what they should be using the incubation zone, the transformation zone is, how do I catch the next wave and incorporate it into my system, as opposed to becoming roadkill by the innovator's dilemma. And so in that model, the question is, you keep it in the incubation zone as long as you can, and you go to the transformation zone when the category is what we call entering the tornado. Because when the category enters the tornado, that means everybody who is a potential customer for this product will have budget for it this year. That's how you know you're in a tornado. For the first time, for years you've been calling on customers. They didn't have budget for what you're doing, but they'd find budget, or you try to work with them to get budget. There's a year when they have budget. In fact, they put out an RFP for it. That's the year where if you're not in the game that year, you're going to be marginalized. And so at that point, you must transform the company. And that's what but you're using the transformation zone almost like a defense as opposed to an offense.
Well, that means that the product or service people need to interact well with the channel folks, right? I mean, in that grid that you have. How does that work? I mean, how do those relationships get established? I mean, you said that the CEO lives in the transformation zone. Is that kind of part of what the CEO is doing, kind of stitching together those new interfaces?
Well, yeah. First of all, before the transformation starts, the performance zone basically is run by a chief revenue officer and a chief product officer, and there's a kind of a matrix that makes that work. And the CEO can supervise that, but frankly, if they have the right two people in those roles, those people are very competent people. And they should be able to run that. But when now you're doing a transformation, you're upsetting the apple cart because all of their success metrics are now being put in jeopardy. Because what the CEO says with the transformation is, you have to take this still nascent capability where we really don't have proven track record yet, and the customers are still a little bit hesitant, and you just got to jam it into your numbers. And you got to make, and by the way, you got to make these numbers. And the problem, and your salespeople aren't quite ready for it. We did some acquisitions, and they're not as integrated as we want them to be. It's a mess, and transformation zones are usually a mess. But you just have to fight your way through it. That the CEO is the only person who can push that, because if you try to do it with anybody more junior than the CEO, the performance people will blow them off. They'll just say, "No, that's not what I do." And so it's really important for the CEO at that point to lean in.
Yeah. Well, you didn't mention accounting, but you kind of referenced it. I'm launching a new business here at UC Berkeley, and the administrators are like, "This is great. Now we got a new place to slap a whole bunch of overhead," right? It's like, why are you doing this? You're just killing the baby in the crib. And so, why do they do that, and how do you make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, okay. So in a business that's legacy has been going on for decades, they do this thing in the performance zone where they allocate expenses back to the performance zone, the productivity zone. So the finance team, the IT team, facilities, anything that's a cost center, we're going to allocate it back to the performance zone, and branding, corporate branding, and all that kind of stuff. You guys are all going to pay a tax for that, which drives the performance zone crazy. And it's not a good idea. The productivity zone should just say, look, how much money are we going to spend in my zone? And then we should manage those expenses. We shouldn't allocate them to somebody else. We know damn well if we allocate nothing to the performance zone, we'll be in jail. Productivity zone will be in jail. We have to do these things. So let's just be honest about it and don't reallocate it. But then when you try to put that stuff onto an incubation business, it's crazy, because the incubation business has no revenue. It's spending more than it's making. So it's like, why are you allocating expenses to something that's already a deficit endeavor? And it's part of the productivity zone. Every zone's got its own sort of disease, and the productivity zone wants everything to be very neat and tidy, and they want to be able to not be at risk themselves. They're very risk. The goal of the zone is to do risk management, and so it attracts risk-averse people. But then when they try to export the risk-averse model into any of the other three zones, that creates failure. Any model that works for one zone will create failure in the other three. So the productivity zone failure mode is to become increasingly risk-averse. First in the performance zone, so you start selling only the things that are highest margin, and if its cost to book is too great, you reduce the number of salespeople. You do all the kind of things to manage the numbers, which looks good to investors and looks kind of crummy to customers. And there's no room to invest in the future, and you don't, and you become marginal. In the incubation zone, it's the opposite, right? You guys say, no. The incubation zone danger is if you give it too much money, it'll spend it on all kinds of things because it likes to spend money. You have to say, no, you've got to become more powerful. And every time I give you money, you owe me more power. And you have to demonstrate that power with winning customers or winning adoption, or we have to agreed upon metric about how I know you're more powerful, or I'm not giving you any more money. And that's what venture capitalists are so good at. They're really good at doing that.
Yeah, but it seems like being a CEO of a large corporation now is even harder than being a venture capitalist, because if you're a venture capitalist, you're typically dealing with early stage companies one after the other. If you're like a CEO from the 1950s, you're sitting on you're just trying to milk your money behind your moat and everything. And it seems like today, if you're going to be a CEO like Satya Nadella, or you have this portfolio of mature businesses and startups, and you've got to somehow manage your attention and your day, and then you have to switch gears, and when you're dealing with one direct report versus another. I mean, is this like the most difficult job on the planet?
Yeah, maybe. Particularly if you're in an industry that's being disrupted, and you're running an enterprise at scale. Like Irving's trying to bring IBM back into the mix. IBM's been off the table for a long time. So I would want. IBM was the company when I joined the tech sector. IBM was the standard. There was nobody the number two. That they were the standard, And I think what Gerstner came back in the 90s, he did an amazing thing for them to get them. We're not just hardware, we're software and services, and that was a success math. But in this century, IBM's lost power every single year of this century. It's 25 years in. Every year it has less power than it had the year before. And largely because it was run under an ethic of shareholder returns for a very, very long time. I don't think that's what Irving's doing, but sure as heck was what Sam and I'm forgetting her name right at the moment, but the last two CEOs both ran investor-led agendas. No, customers first, employees second, investors third, and it's hard because if you're not the founder, the board hires you to improve shareholder returns. That's your job. And so, I mean, that's how you're measured. And TSRs is like total shareholder returns is the compensation system. So it's obvious why it happens. I'm not trying to say people are crazy, but we now should know that it just doesn't work.
Well, I mean, most of these companies are run by engineers. There aren't as many MBAs running tech companies.
Well, that actually is a good thing.
Yeah,
Seriously.
well, I mean, it's a problem, I think, for my industry.
In terms of okay, but the good part
I teach
about
engineering also, and so I'm hedged. But
but to be fair, what I like about engineers is engineers are systems thinkers. I mean, you can't be an engineer and not be a systems thinker. It doesn't work. So I like the fact that they take a systems view of things. Now, if they don't have the EQ to compensate with the IQ, then if they can't tell a narrative, then that doesn't work either. You have to be able to tell the narrative. And so that's what makes, that's what makes Benioff such a good CEO. It's what makes, Satya such a good CEO. John Chambers was fabulous with the narratives. I mean, you need, but it's got to be a narrative that's credible. It can't be a narrative that's based on, just happy talk or bravado. It's got to be based on the fact that the world now needs a set of capabilities that we are uniquely positioned to provide if we step up to the challenge. And that's the narrative that you continually want to be, I think, working as a CEO.
Well, I want to go back to your dissertation, right, which was strategy for living. I found that I'm more often now asked about career strategies and personal strategies, and I've found that there are actually quite a few similarities between business strategy and individual career strategy, because we're basically the CEO of our own enterprise, right?
We are.
You actually are for real. But I mean, even if you're just an employee at a company, you're managing your career. And so, what kind of analogies could we make here?
Well, I think if you think about it, I'm the CEO, so I'm interested in the market cap of my company, which is me. Okay.
Yeah.
So market cap is a function of a combination of a track record of performance combined with a position of power. So if you're managing your career, the question would be, what could I be doing in the next year that if I put it on my resume, people would go, whoa, that was kind of cool. Now, it used to be in my dad's era, it was just go up the career ladder. I mean, it was a hierarchical system, and frankly, there was director, senior director, vice president, senior vice president, executive vice president, president, blah blah blah. Okay, so that's the career ladder. That ladder doesn't work anymore. We're in a contractor modeled economy, so it's got to be more like, what's your claim to fame? And what that normally means is, whatever job you do, A, you better do the job well, you're not going to keep it. But B, find the thing that you can do beyond the limits of your job that does something that people go, and it's usually your boss or your boss's boss saying, want something done, and you say, I'll do that. And it's not in your job description, and it's extra work, and you're going to work late. But A, you're going to get more exposure up to the higher parts of the company, which is great for your career. But also B, you're going to have to go work collaboratively across functions, which is an incredibly challenging problem. So you get that. So we call them single accountable leaders. And my wish for executives when they're trying to develop bench strength is to look at the body of work and outcomes that they're responsible for and find these initiatives that they can assign to people as single accountable leaders, A, to take a little bit off of their own plate, but B, to allow that person to take the next step in their career development. So I think single accountable leaders of cross-functional initiatives, that's what I'd be looking for in a career development plan.
Yeah, but should we be thinking about these different zones in our own lives, right? So, do I need to think about having an incubation zone where
Well,
I'm,
first of all,
learning golf or something? I don't know.
Good. Yeah, I'm working on my golf. No, I think the first thing is you start with your performance zone. And the question you should ask your performance zone is, someone is paying me money. What outcomes are they buying from me? Am I fulfilling those outcomes? So that's number one. Then number two is, if I could do that more efficiently, that would make my life easier, and B, that would give me resources that I could potentially use in the incubation zone to explore something beyond the minimum. But like that single accountable leader idea, if you're behind in the performance zone, even if you volunteer, they're going to say, no, Jeff, you gotta do better on just your day job before you worry about that. So I do think, what's my performance zone? What is the University of Berkeley buying from you, really? What outcomes do they really want to buy? Now, the danger that you and I were talking about is the outcomes may not be authentic outcomes. It's possible that institutions have inauthentic outcomes that they want to buy from you. And that's actually a time where you have to think about, maybe I don't belong in this institution, because you do not want to be in service to inauthentic outcomes.
Well, if we went back in time, I mean, would you say to your younger self while you were teaching your Renaissance literature classes that you ought to be reading up on sales and marketing, because you might find it handy in your
Never. Not in a million years. Seriously, I thought I was going to be an English professor for life. I mean, I really thought that's how it's going to work. And so, there's just a couple of times in life where, life just hands you a curveball, and you go or you don't. Yeah.
Well, I guess the equivalent would be then, if you are teaching Renaissance literature, maybe you would, I don't know, read some 18th century stuff, I think French literature, and
if I were still teaching Renaissance literature, because I just wrote something about Beowulf. I'm going to probably put that out someplace. Well, why? First of all, why in the world would you write anything about Beowulf? I mean, what's going on?
What hasn't been written about Beowulf?
Exactly. I mean, really? And so obviously Beowulf has not changed. So what has changed is the world. So the question really is, does the world of today, if you look at yourself through the lens of a classical work of literature today, would you see something different than when I was teaching English 50 years ago? And the answer is you sure as hell would. And so I think the purpose of literature and of the humanities in general is to say, look, these are lenses to look at yourself through. I mean, all these fictional characters, every fictional character is a strategy for living. Harry Potter has a strategy for living, right? So what, you don't have a magic wand, but maybe you can work on, what you got. So the idea behind that is literature gives you role models that you can think about. Is there some part of that strategy that I should be absorbing? And what I like about fiction is, if it's good fiction, it will apply tests against the strategy that challenge the strategy. Escape fiction, every strategy works perfectly, and Superman never gets, it's all terrific. But serious literature often puts you up against it, and I think that's very healthy.
Well, I think one of your heroes is Northrop Frye, and I remember when I was down at Duke in the 90s, and I was like, hey, what's this literary criticism stuff? And so I decided just to go and educate myself. And of course, he was one of the first people that I read. And I mean, nobody goes back and reads old critics. If you're an academic in the English department now, you're reading, MLA last month, right? I mean, is there still value in going back and looking at the old critics? And I say old meaning like from 1950.
Well, but I mean, so how about Sir Philip Sidney, who was writing in 1590s? Yeah. But by the way, he wrote a thing called The Defense of Poetry, and yes, I do think it's worth rereading. So I think that, in fact, the danger of being modern is you get caught up in the latest set of semi-inauthentic issues, like this whole thing, with deconstruction, and just everything is language, and there's only the text, and there's no author, and there's no reader, and there's a bunch of stuff that was at the margin. It was kind of provocative, and when you first heard about it, it's kind of fun, and then after a while, it's like, I'm sorry, that's not equipment for living, and I think that's the standard we should use. Is this discipline, is this piece of work can it contribute to a strategy for living? And I would say Fry's Anatomy of Criticism, yeah, still it was essentially Jungian. So then the question was, would Jung contribute to a strategy for living? And a lot of Jungians thought they could, and I think it was a case for that. So yeah.
And so there's one other framework that I really liked in your book, and I'm using the term framework consciously because I think you have a lot of frameworks, and this one was about the meaning of good. And you talked about how, we use it in three different senses. We talk about something being moral, right? We talk about something being pleasurable, and we talk about something being useful. And it seems like if we could live in a world where we checked all three of those boxes, I mean, life would be pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the issue is we get confused when we use the word good, and the listener hears one version of it, and we're meaning the other version. And so
it's equivocation, right?
Yeah, I think utilitarians got into trouble with that, because utilitarians wanted to say that the good was the greatest good for the greatest number, and that basically good was a derivative of pleasure. And the answer is sometimes, but that's probably not the right framework. And so I think if we keep them separate, then I think, because I was trying to figure out, well, where does moral good come from? Remember, if there's no God, then, I mean, you still would do things that are pleasurable. And Darwin selects for things that are useful. So pleasure was built into desire, and usefulness was built into Darwinism. But morality was not. And so where was morality coming from? And as I said earlier, I ended up deciding it came from the mammalian experiences of family nurture and respect for elders and stuff like that. But I think each one, you need to say, well, which good am I talking about here? Because, it's like cheating on a test. Well, is it useful? Yes, it's useful. Pleasurable? Not necessarily. Moral? Probably not. But the point is, if you check yourself against those three, then you can be careful about what you're saying. I'm going to do good. And I made the claim that ethics was about doing good, which is weird because a lot of ethics is written about following rules and obeying rules. And I think that's a really bad start for ethics. I think, that doesn't help to me. So I like the idea of, no, doing good is, it's going to create a reward, the reward of pleasure, the reward of usefulness, or the reward of essentially of benefit to others. That's really the good that comes out of moral action.
Well, I think in your dissertation title, you used the word virtuous. And is that part of our job as leaders? I mean, to not only be virtuous, but to kind of, sculpt virtue in our organization, help the people who work with us and for us to become better people?
I think the word, I'm very fond of the existentialists when they talk about authenticity, because I think the thing that a leader has to do is to let people be authentic, to help people become authentic, or not to put it differently, not to create pressures for them to be inauthentic. And there's lots of pressures in rooms. Like right now, we have the President of the United States is encouraging everybody on the planet to be inauthentic, dramatically inauthentic. That's inexcusable. That tone at the top, if you were on the board of directors of the United States, you would fire the president, because tone at the top is one of the critical success factors of a CEO. And it's just not okay to do that. But as a CEO, it's very important you create tone at the top. And that tone is not like, you have to have my moral system or somebody else's moral system, but you have to be authentic to your own moral system, and you can't violate it in your performance. You have to act it out, not subvert it.
Well, look, one last question. You talk about meditation, and you practice meditation. How did you discover this, and when did this become part of your life?
It was
and
fun.
How has it helped you?
It was great. Marie and I was in the 60s. So the 60s, we just discovered marijuana, which was a fantastic discovery. And actually, LSD was just showing up. Oh, that's pretty good too. Anyway, so Marie and I go to Seattle and to go to grad school, and a very good friend of mine's there. And he says, I'm going to try this thing called transcendental meditation. I thought, well, what the hell, why not? And I've been reading books. I kind of knew I wanted to be somehow enlightened. I don't know what the heck I really thought it was, but so when we did it, we just did it, and I thought, oh, and so I made it a habit, and I've been meditating every day for 55 years. It's a game changer. I mean, it takes time to change the game, but it's a game changer because it just lets you kind of get centered in a way that, frankly, it's just I mean, there are other ways to do it. It's not the only way to get there, but boy, it's been huge. And so, and I think being centered is part of, if you're going to be a counselor, and my job as a teacher or your teacher, I'm a counselor, same kind of thing. You don't want to impose your neuroses on other people. I mean, it's just bad enough you have to work with them on your own. And so the more centered you can be, at least in your performing, when you're performing with others, the better. And if you're carrying around a lot of, kind of bad memory stuff, as everybody, I mean, God knows we all have stuff that's, the darker side. If you carry that around with you, it's hard to do that. What meditating lets you do is it lets you it's like washing, it's like taking a shower. It washes that away. It'll come back, but you wash it away again, it comes back. But after a while, it gets harder for it to stick because it's a discipline. It's very, very reassuring.
Yeah, it's also something we don't teach in business schools. And I'm wondering, it seems like temperament and character and these sorts of things are super helpful to be a successful leader. And maybe they should be...
I think at some point we got to realize the schools only can do so much. I mean, the parents have to do most, right? And then I think as you become an adult, it's your job. And, I think, we're playing limited engagement here, people. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is actually the play. So it's like, maybe we should step up and take it as seriously as we can, because there's not a do-over here. This is it. And I think if we take ourselves seriously, then I think we should invest in ourselves in whatever way we think is going to be, supportive of the life we want to lead.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much. We've got a whole bunch of books that you should check out, of course, Crossing the Chasm, in marketing, sales, organizational theory, strategy, and even metaphysics and ethics. So thanks a lot. Talk to you soon.
Well, Greg, thanks for having these questions. This was really fun for me.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.